Okay, so I wanted to turn to the journalists on this panel. And I think maybe just to start to hear from everyone, like, why do you think that the topic of emissions from animal ag is covered kind of comparatively smaller than other sources of emissions in climate media? Tamar, I'm going to start with Tamar Haspel. I keep forgetting to say everyone's title because I sort of feel like I know all of you, but author and columnist at the Washington Post. So
thanks, Jenny, and thanks for inviting me, and thanks for hosting this. I think there are a number of reasons, but I actually think the predominant one is that people like meat. Mm-hmm. And so writing about it becomes kind of a challenging thing because you basically end up telling people to eat less beef. And that's a message that people tend to be hostile to. Ask me how I know. And it's not like writing about other kinds of like fossil fuels, because when we're talking about fossil fuels, we're talking about giving people an alternative. But when we're talking about meat, the alternatives that we give them are unpalatable to a lot of people, figuratively, literally, every which way that it can be unpalatable. And so the fact that people like it, there's no good alternative. You end up sounding like a nanny stater when you talk about it. And also, it's disputed. I mean, nobody really disagrees fundamentally about fossil fuels, but people do disagree fundamentally about meat. Now, I think that there's a right and a wrong here, and some of the people who disagree are simply wrong. But there is a strong contingent disagreeing, which means that if you're going to write about it, kind of every time you do it, you sort of have to adjudicate it over and over again. So I think that animal ag and meat are sort of materially different from some of the other things that climate journalists write about. And it's kind of easy to gloss over it.
Yeah, it just as you're talking makes me think that like writing about energy, no one really starts questioning what you're doing in your own home usually. Whereas if you're someone who writes about the food system, usually it does tend to get personal because we all know food is personal. Michael Grunwald, who's author and columnist at Canary Media, I'm going to remember to get everyone's title in here. Do you have any thoughts on like why this topic isn't necessarily covered as much by climate media?
Well, I do agree that there's sort of a demand side problem rather than necessarily a supply side problem, right? I mean, usually panels like this, we all talk about how the media suck and you know, they're doing it all wrong. And of course the media does suck and we are doing it all wrong. But in this case, I agree with Tamar that there's sort of a problem on the audience demand side, but I'm not sure I agree that it's just because people like meat. I actually think that, you know, sort of stories about how kind of meat is the problem are actually a little bit cliquey. And people do sort of like those stories, even if they don't like the answer. But I think talking about animal agriculture, I mean, I think it's awesome that you got 700 people to listen to this. But I've found it very difficult, you know, now that I'm sort of, you know, I've gone from Politico magazine writing about, you know, Trump and, you know, the sexy stuff to trying to write about, you know, how to feed the world without frying the world. I think most of what we're talking about is farms and forests that make up 98.5% of our planet, or at least our land. But it's flyover country, right? It's like we fly over it or we hike through it or we, you know, but we get the fruits of it, but we don't really think about it in our day-to-day life. And I'm not sure people are all that interested in it. There's this real demand for, you know, I find like people are kind of looking for ammunition rather than information. And so to some extent, like if there are people who have a kind of a dog in this fight, and so if you write about regenerative agriculture or industrial agriculture, people who love or hate those things will pay attention. But for most of us who are just trying to hash out these issues of food and farms and forests and, you know, how to make the emissions work and the land use work and what are technologies that can improve it, I don't think people give a shit. I wish they did.
Great.
I'm writing a book about it, but
Yeah, I mean, I think. Well, anyway, I have thoughts, but I'm not a panelist. I'm just a moderator today. So, Sonalie Figueiras, who is founder of Green Queen, right? You're nodding along. Did you have some thoughts on that and like why this is not always such a well-covered topic? You and I have been in sort of climate journalist calls where we're both like systems, and sometimes we're the only people yelling. So, oh, and you're muted. Unmute. Still muted.
I'm nodding along. Definitely some really good points by both Tamar and Michael. I think there's no doubt that food is very different than energy and transport and weather and a lot of these other associated topics that kind of make up climate headlines. But I think that we're being a little unfair about kind of food in the climate pantheon, if you will, because if you look at the work of the great folks at Covering Climate Now, just 4 years ago, they came into existence because the climate story wasn't being told properly enough in mainstream media. And now we're sort of like taking it for granted that like people are considering things like energy and transport in the climate story and even things like weather. But that wasn't the case 4 years ago. And I don't feel like food has had its Covering Climate Now moment. And as you know, Jenny, I actually wrote a proposal that I sent to you and that I sent to Covering Climate Now, which is basically like, can we please launch Covering Food and Climate Now? Because I just don't know that context is there for most people, that we're not solving the climate crisis without sorting out how we grow our food. And I also find that a lot of the answers that I'm hearing tend to be from regions where, like North America and potentially Europe, where there's plenty of farmland and there's plenty of ruminating animals. I'm sitting in Asia. We have hundreds of millions of people in urban cities. And I think when you're in Asia, which is where 60% of the world's population lives, and where a lot of kind of social mobility and economic mobility is happening, and we know that we have kind of this like supply and demand problem with like so many people and not enough kind of land to grow food, I think there's a little bit more of an awareness that we sort of have to figure stuff out and think alternatively. And so even all our governments have to think about food security differently. But again, we don't see that really reflected in the media. So I think there's the livestock issue. There's also just like the basic food systems issue. And I don't know that it's clear to most people that there is this food and climate connection. Now, I think Tamar is right, though. Food is very different from energy and transport. It's very personal. I mean, for most of our history as a species, just getting food was kind of the whole point of what we were trying to do to survive. So food plays a very different role for people than, what energy source is coming into their home. So I think even if we did get to 4 years from now where food is being reported on in a much stronger way in the climate story, I still think it will be challenging. And I still think there will be people that come to the table looking for ammunition, not information. That was a great line, Michael. But I don't think we've given food a fair shot yet in the climate story.
I just want to make sure we
not livestock at all.
Yeah. I want to make sure we get Nico in here. So because actually Nico Muzi, I'm going to say your last name wrong, from Madre Brava, managing director of Madre Brava, who also did some research that looked at this, but also more sweeping research. So just because Sonalie mentioned like what people know, so you have some insight on that based on the reporting or the study you all did. Can you share a little bit about that?
So, thanks for the invitation and hi to everyone. On your first question, I agree with the fact that food is very cultural and it's personal, not fossil fuels. The heating up in your home, the fuel that you put in your car is not so relatable. I think that is based on the analysis we did, the media analysis we did, which wasn't as exhaustive as the one that you did, guys. But it came to the same conclusions. And what we tend to see is that most of the coverage on the climate impacts of meat is driven by NGOs and scientific studies, and our work on this for the past year has seen that, and rightly so, we haven't seen a lot of campaigning groups and philanthropy money going into this space, and that creates a sort of underreporting or vacuum of news stories. I think that's something that we're going to see change now as we realize that food is the next frontier in the climate battle. But we are basically paying that cost of fewer campaigning groups and fewer philanthropy dollars coming into this space, as we have now starting to decarbonize thanks to the solar revolution and the wind revolution, energy, and then transport with electrification of transport. I'm hopeful that we could see that. And the other point I wanted to make is the size of the industry that we are talking about. If we should not underestimate the misinformation campaigns of the spin doctors by the industry, and we have seen more and more of that work happening. But just to give you a size of the problem, the smartphone industry is around roughly globally $500 billion business. The meat industry is almost 3 times that. It's 1.3, 1.4 trillion. So that also shows the resources they have available to basically protect their business model, which is obviously rotten and obsolete. When it comes to the research we did on consumers in the UK, France, Germany, the US, and Brazil, we see that across the globe, in this, when you ask people to rank the top 5, or from a list of topics and contributors to climate change, what are the leading drivers? Industrial meat comes at the bottom, and things like even aviation or cars, which are smaller in size, do come top of mind, and that's because of reporting or the lack of reporting in the media.
Thank you, and thanks for that. I do want to ask Tamar, just because, and everyone at this point, just like jump in, not all at once, but let's definitely just dig. I know you all have lots of things to say, but because I've known, your coverage on GMOs, I was curious if there were any kind of through lines or things that you see that were sort of challenging in covering that issue that come up again in covering this issue, that, I don't know, maybe there are some lessons there for journalists.
There totally are. And one of the through lines, and a couple people have mentioned, what are the things that people are interested in? And there are a couple of flashpoints in food that do get people interested. And GMOs were certainly one of them. I don't know that they really are anymore, thankfully. But I was writing my column when it was all the rage, and I think this idea of replacing natural foods with artificial things is something that people really balk at. It's something that people can get united against. But if you widen the lens and you say, okay, well, what are the other things? And Sonalie, your comment about having more, better, deeper food coverage, on the one hand, I am so there for that. And my column's subhead should be, boring people witless with agronomical minutia, since whenever my column has been in. And if we're writing about climate and agriculture, the Venn diagram of stories that are relevant and stories that people are interested in, I think the overlap is pretty small. And if you're talking about agriculture in a bigger way, nobody's going to want to know about the new study that shows, yield suppression from cover crops or no-till sequestering carbon. I'm an expert on what bores people witless, and those things bore people witless. And so, but if you're talking about animal ag specifically, it becomes really problematic because, your bottom line is always, eat less beef. And, you guys are sentient media. You care about animal ag in so many ways. And one of the difficulties is that if we're going to have a food supply that is both, has an animal food supply that is both has a smaller impact and better animal welfare, those two goals are at odds, because as soon as you make the system less efficient, which is what animal welfare requires, you make it more impactful. And so, once you say, hey, eat less beef, there's not much left for people who are thinking about this from a perspective of what can I do with my diet, and what you're left with is the 7 people who are actually interested in agriculture.
Yeah, I mean, and not everyone shares my opinion at Sentient Media, but my feeling is like, a good piece of coverage will at least address the trade-offs there. Since I don't think, like that I don't think most people think the food system is going to go sort of like vegan overnight or something like that. But I think like at least what I hope for is, and what we try to do is to just like address the trade-offs of that tension that you're talking about. That, if everybody just eats more chicken, what does that look like for our food system, and for the animals in our food system, right?